Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're on week 16 and it's Easter Sunday today, so happy Easter everyone. Hope you're having a lovely restful day. Now as it's Easter and we're doing a nature-based prompt, it had to be eggs this week, and so we're going to be creating quite a three-dimensional piece using felt, and I hope you've been collecting your thread scraps in your little jar because they're going to come in very useful this week if you want to stitch along with me. So I'm going to carry on working in our pastel colour scheme, grab wee bits and pieces, and let's get stitching. Okay, so I'm going to be working on this lovely pastel green felt today, and I've just gathered my bits and pieces together. So I've got my thread rainbow and I've got these two variegated threads because I think they might come in useful today. I've got my felt scraps as well, and when I say scraps I really mean scraps. You can use very small pieces, so don't worry about cutting into big sheets. I've looked in my waste bin. I keep every offcut of every piece of felt that I use because we're going to use them in lots of different ways today. I've got some other threads over here, and I've got my thread ends jar from all of the other pieces that I've done this month so far. So I've been collecting up the thread scraps and they're going to come in useful in a moment. I want to take us back to two designs that I've talked about already. So in the week where we did our nesting prompt, I came up with this idea of a nest on a branch with some eggs in it, and I said that I really liked this idea and I was very tempted to do it. So I was thinking about that one, and I was also thinking about our prompt from week 14 where we talked about mini eggs, and I thought as it was Easter Sunday, this seemed like a really good opportunity to use this idea. And so what I'm going to do is combine the two, and we're going to construct a nest from our thread ends, and we're going to build some little three-dimensional felt eggs in pastel shades to sit in our nest. So I'm going to start with the eggs because it seems like a good place to start. And I've cut myself a little template. Now this is really small. If I just get my ruler here, you can see it's just 2.5 centimeters tall and about just over a centimetre wide. And I did this in the same way that I made our umbrella template last week. So I folded a piece of card in half and drew an arc shape that's wider at the bottom. It's not just an oval, it's sort of wider, it's more of a teardrop shape. And then I cut it out, and that's my template. And we're going to need 4 of these for each egg. So if this is too small for you, by all means make a bigger one. I really like working in miniature, but I know it's very fiddly as well and it puts people off sometimes. So this is a similar technique to the one I use in my Easter eggs set that is available on our website, and it's the last day today that you can use that voucher code. So because you're watching Winging It, I'm going to give you the voucher code anyway. It's Easter 22 and it will give you 25% off the cost of those templates, and it's a set of 10 felt eggs with embroidery guide and thread colour guide and full-size templates and everything, and it's a PDF download, so it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you can still download it. Okay, so I've drawn around my template 4 times. So what I'm going to do first is add some knots as little speckles like we talked about with mini eggs, and I'm going to use my variegated thread because I thought it would be nice to have a little bit of mixture of colours going on. So I want a piece that isn't yellow because I want to have some variation. There we go, got green and purple here. So I've got 2 strands, and before I've cut them out, I'm just going to add some little French knots, and I might add in some colonial knots as well. I'm just going to do a single wrap because I want them to be small. You could add any patterns to your eggs if you wanted to. I'm just going to do speckles because it reminds me of mini eggs. And the reason I haven't cut them out is because they're so small, it's just going to be quite tricky to manage holding onto the shape. So in order to get some green, I'm going to finish my thread there and move on to my next egg until I've run out of the purple and I can get some green going on. The only thing to be aware of is that you need to keep your thread ends away from the edges, because when you do cut, you don't want to accidentally cut the knot that's holding your thread in place. I'm starting to come into the green now, so I'm going to do some colonial knots. So if you remember, that was similar to a French knot, but you add a little extra scoop. If you're not sure about these knots, it's an April stitch tutorial that you need, and I'll put a card at the top of the screen so that you can find your way there and learn how to do these knots that I'm doing. Okay, so I've got my little speckles on my eggs, so now I'm going to cut these shapes out, and I'm just going to make sure, I'm going to keep checking the back to make sure that I'm not going anywhere near my stitches. So this will be fiddly. I sort of apologise, but I sort of don't, because it's just fun. So what I'm after is some yellow thread, because these stitches will be visible and I don't want them to be too visible. And this time I'm just going to use a single strand. I'm going to use it, you could use just normal sewing cotton if you wanted to. And I've got quite a fine needle because I don't want too big a hole for the thread to pass through, otherwise it's going to make life difficult for me. I'm going to just put in a really sizable knot there so that I can make sure that the knot doesn't pull through the felt. So what I'm going to do is just line up 2 of my shapes, and I'm going to start at the top of my egg, and I'm going to just whip stitch, tuck my knot in, I'm going to whip stitch along one edge. So my first stitch is going to go over the point, and I'm just going along, so I'm going through one side, out the other, and the thread forms a loop or a bar over the top. And I'm trying to keep my stitches fairly even. The thread won't show up too much, and they are very small, so it's not going to be a huge problem. But I'm trying to keep them fairly even and regular, just so the finish is nice. Just make sure, like, my thread there is hooked onto another stitch. You don't want any loose stitches, so you don't want to pull everything tight, but if you've got a loose stitch it will form a gap in the edge, and we don't want that. So just make sure that all of your stitches are pulled through fully. So my last stitch is going to go at the point at the bottom of the egg, and then I'm going to open up those pieces so it's like a little bowl, like a cup, and I'm going to line up and make sure that it's the right way round. So remember, there's a longer end and a shorter end, and I'm going to work my way. I've lined up my third egg piece, and I'm going to work my way back up the egg, attaching that new piece. So again, my last stitch is going to go through the very point at the top, and so now I've got 3 pieces, so I'm opening it up again and lining up my 4th piece. I'm going to work my way back down the egg, adding that 4th piece in, and that should just leave me with 1 open side. I'm going to use that to fill the egg with stuffing. Right, so we're going to work our way halfway or a little way up this final side. So before I go, I just want to make sure that there's no hole at the bottom. So I'm just going to work across. So I've got a stitch crossing over to opposite sides of the egg, just to make sure that I don't have a big hole at the bottom where all 4 of those pieces meet. So I'm going to work my way a little distance up the egg, just so the hole's not so big, because we want the stuffing to stay put. We don't want to push it in one end and have it all falling out the other. So we don't need a massive hole. So I've gone about halfway along there. Now I'm not going to cut my thread, I'm just going to keep hold of it, and I just want to open that hole up a little bit. So I'm just going to get my scissor blades in there closed and just push out the sides so that it's not all caving in. Now you can stuff with a range of things. I've got just some trimmings here that I got from my page, and I've got the rest of the piece. So rather than using anything new, I'm just going to use up these scraps that would otherwise go in the bin, and I'm just going to cut up my felt into tiny pieces. If you leave them too big, your egg will be lumpy, so we want them nice and small. So I'm just guiding those pieces inside the egg with my scissor blade, and you'll be surprised at how much stuffing such a tiny little egg will take. That's taken all of that off cut, so even though it's a very tiny little egg, it has taken quite a lot of filling. So all I do now is close up the hole. So I'm going to carry on with my whip stitch, and when I get to the top, I'm going to do the same as I did at the bottom and just make sure that I don't have a hole by making a cross over the top, going from one side of my egg to the other. Then I'm going to finish my thread. Put a little quilter's knot in there. And then we're going to do a little bit of magic, because I'm going to take my needle through my egg and just bring it out somewhere far away. And I'm going to use my scissors to push down on the egg, and I'm going to pull quite firmly on my thread. And then when I cut it, the thread end will just disappear back inside the egg, and I'll get quite a neat finish. So I'm just going to squeeze it about a bit just to make sure I've got a nice egg shape. So that's my first speckled egg. I'm going to make a few more and then we'll come back and look at how we make our nest. Okay, so we have our 3 little mini eggs here, and I've stopped at 3 because when I placed them on my panel I thought that probably looked like it was enough. So what we're going to do now is create a nest out of my thread scraps, and I'm just going to bundle them into the centre for a moment and create a bit of a hollow, because my eggs are going to sit inside this hollow just like a bird's nest, so they will sit in there a bit like that. So I'm happy with the way that looks and the way it's sitting. So I've threaded up my needle with 2 strands of my variegated thread, and what I'm going to try and do is just put in some stitches initially that just trap that bundle of threads down onto my felt. And I can be quite haphazard with this because it's a bit of a mess anyway. So we can just put stitches here and there that are just going to hold all the thread scraps down. I don't want to flatten them completely, so I'm trying to make sure that my stitches sort of curl over the thread scraps. So these stitches are fairly loose, they're not keeping everything really tight. I just want things secure but not flattened down to the surface of the felt. Now you might be watching this thinking that I've completely lost my mind and this is the most horrific thing you can imagine doing. So if you want to make a nest in a different way, that's absolutely fine. I thought it would be good to add some bullion knots to the nest because I want it to look like a bird has made this out of lots of different branches and twigs. I'm just going to make a bit of a sort of tangle of bullion knots. So let's do some coming in from the outside first of all. I'm not being particularly fussy about whether these knots are going to sit flat or arch up and form little bridges. I don't really mind because it's all going to add to the effect of the nest. What I do want is to make sure that they're going at different angles, so I don't want them all just coming in from the edge, and I want them different lengths as well. Okay, so I've added in my bullion knots. If I bring it up to the camera you should be able to see them a little bit more closely. They're quite subtle and I quite like that because bullion knots tend to, because they're so chunky, they can tend to dominate a design, so I quite like the fact that they're more subtle and we've got all of the different pastel shades in there. So I'm just going to rough my edges back up because I do want them trapped down, but I also want them 3-dimensional. So I'm just using the eye end of my needle to pull up those outer edges a little bit so that the nest is more like a bowl shape, just a little bit like that. And so now all that we have left to do is place our eggs. So I'm going to just get some normal sewing cotton. This one is going to be quite 3-dimensional. I think we set a precedent for that in our last live stream when we used those big chunky beads. So what I want to do is just catch those eggs in place. So I'm coming up from the back and I'm just taking my needle through the bottom of the egg and catching it down on the surface, and I'm going to do that a few times just to make sure it's securely in place there. So there's not particularly a right way to do this. What I would say is just go in a couple of different directions, because it's going to help your egg. If you only put stitches in one direction, the egg's going to wobble around quite a lot. So it's good to just come at your egg from several different directions and make sure you've got stitches that are holding it down in lots of different ways, and that way it's going to be really secure. So there's my first egg. You can see it does move a little bit, but it's not particularly mobile. So I'm just going to add in my other two. I'm going to try and angle them slightly differently so they look more natural. I mean, I say natural, I don't know what kind of bird would make a nest like this and lay eggs like this, but I don't want them to look too organised in the nest. So I've got my pastel mini eggs in my thread scrap nest. It's a really cute 3-dimensional piece. I think that's a lot of fun. So I hope you've enjoyed that. Next week is our live stream, so do join me at 2:30 p.m. British Summer Time for a live stitch along, and can't wait to see what you come up with for the eggs prompt. So have a great week, happy crafting, and I'll see you next time. Bye.